Hello, Scott Howard here again with you for another chapter reading from 3 Days and 2 Nights, an amusing Arthurian adventure. It is my new novel being published by the Piedmont Journal of Poetry and Fiction and due out in July of 2016. If you wish to read the novel, we're publishing it in serial, that is in sections, one a month from now until June, on the website of our publisher, the Piedmont Journal of Poetry and Fiction. If you're looking for the website, you can go online at www.piedmontjpf.com. That's piedmontjpf.com. You can also like me on Facebook, Scott Davis Howard. It's my author page, and I will keep you updated with everything that's coming out and discussions and things like that. So, in any case, let us begin. Chapter 10, which is today's chapter, will be the final day. It comes on the heels of Chapter 9, which we just read, in which there was a giant bonfire, and the druid Cathbad read the omens and discovered that they were going to be victorious, at least according to him and his gods. And the only caveat to that was that one of them would not survive the next day. And with that, we're going to start Chapter 10, which is the first chapter of the final day. Again, the novel is called 3 Days and 2 Nights. It's a bit of a play on words, but the whole story takes place over the course of 3 days and 2 nights. So the final day, Chapter 10, Dawn, Cathbad's Henge. After relieving his bladder in the tall grass, Aelfric yawned and walked back toward the henge. He passed a pile of still warm ash and twisted metal where the wicker giant had been, crunching brittle grass under his feet as he did so. The fire had blackened and crisped a 10-foot circle of vegetation. In its center, the charred and warped remains of Gawain's once elegant armor seemed a sad and pathetic monument to Arthurian knighthood. It cast the faintest of amorphous shadow in the pre-dawn light. Alanbart thought of the gold, garnets, and possibly even rubies that might be buried in the ash, and made a mental note to revisit the spot after it had sufficiently cooled. He paused to listen to a thrush trill a beautiful morning song from deep in the heather. Enchanted by the cheerful innocence of the melody, he sat on a rectangular slab of stone and took in his surroundings. His gaze was drawn to the gathering dawn in the east, and remained fastened there for a time as he went over the events of the previous evening in his mind. After the sacrifice and reading of the omens, the druid had gathered them around the fire and outlined his scheme to recapture the king. First and foremost, he planned to send Scot and Alanbart to defeat the banshee in her bog. He claimed that she guarded the trove of magical treasures that would amplify their powers and improve their chances for success against Rabordath. Cathbad desired 3 particular things: the Hammer of Autumn, an ancient weapon that could sunder anything crafted of dead wood with one blow, and which would grant them immediate entrance to the palisade and the tower. The Staff of Vanamonian, which would multiply his magical abilities tenfold. And the Ring of Mudara, which reportedly held the power to cure blindness. Alanbart saw this as more than a little self-serving on Cathbad's part, as he reaped 90% of the benefit with no danger to his person, but realized, as did everyone else, that the druid stood a better chance of defeating a wizard if he increased his power and regained his sight. The necessity of the hammer was also obvious. Alanbart would have protested, of course, at being included in the party, if you can call 2 a party, that would venture into the bog after the banshee, except that Gonoth grinned evilly at him. He'd swallowed his objections for that reason, and also because of his confidence that he could convince Sir Gawain to go in his stead, which, of course, he accomplished once Cathbad, Gonoth, and Bruzak retired for the evening. The chief danger, according to Cathbad, was the scream of the banshee, which had the power to sever the soul from the body, slaying a person and binding his corpse to the demonic creature in an undeath of eternal servitude. The solution, Cathbad said, was to deafen oneself by shouting and by loud banging of metal on metal directly next to the ears until they began to bleed. At this point, the ear canals would be dried and filled with warm beeswax. The 2 warriors then could commence their attack, impervious to her scream, but would be unable to use the sense of sound to coordinate their attack. The druid also warned them that many powerful warriors served as guards of the banshee's inner sanctum. Each great warrior who faced her over the generations, many of whom originally owned the aforementioned magical artifacts, succumbed to her fatal scream, and served her in death with all of the martial ability that they possessed in life. Scot seemed excited at the prospect of combat with ancient heroes, an idea that chilled Aelfric to his bones. Heather's interactions with Sir Gawain also interested Aelfric. Arthur's knight appeared to be nearly 20 years her senior, but their relationship seemed more romantic than friendly. They shared secret glances and, after the sacrifice, talked in hushed tones. Aelfric felt something rare and unexpected while watching them, a twinge of jealousy. After Aelfric had solved the two dilemmas in the Gloamwood, how to save Gawain and how to placate Scot, Heather thanked him and complimented him on his intelligence, even placing her hand tenderly on his arm, a gentle and warm touch that, inexplicably, he could still feel. He laid his 3 fingers against a spot. Strange, he thought, that she should affect him this way. He'd always considered himself impervious to the charms of women, and sought to keep himself aloof from love and romance. He mentally rebuked himself. Love was a dangerous emotion, and too many knights, all of them better than he, had or would die for it. Paris, Sigmund, Tristan, and possibly Lancelot next. To Aelfric, the physical sensations were not worth either the emotional angst or the negative outcomes. Still, he felt the unbidden beginnings of something for Heather, and despite the fact that he could step outside of himself, look down on those feelings as dangerous and ridiculous, compare himself to Sir Gawain and note his utter deficiency, and judge himself to be the worst possible example of manhood, love, and chivalry, those feelings of affection took root nonetheless. That's just one more reason to escape from this absurd situation before it gets more serious, he thought, sighing and shifting positions on the cold rock. A light breeze ruffled his hair, and his mind returned to Heather. The climactic moment occurred as Aelfric tried to fall asleep, wrapped in a pair of borrowed blankets too thin to warm him. He closed his eyes and made an attempt to control his breathing, but found himself unable to nod off, probably because of the cold and because he hadn't had a drop to drink. Alcohol was his crutch of late in combating chronic insomnia. As he lay there, cold and uncomfortable, he listened to the quiet conversation between Heather and Gawain. "It can never be," the knight insisted gently. "I know that's what you believe," she replied, bitterness in her tone, "but you didn't think so once." "It is difficult to speak of it," he said. "I am a knight of the Round Table, and I have placed a lifetime of belief in the code of chivalry. What we had was not chivalrous, and can never be so now." She remained silent. He continued, his voice gaining power and speed. "You loved me because I was forthright and courteous. Your feelings for me were and are bound up in who I was on that day. The man was honorable. He was a man of his word. He kept his vows. He respected himself. And that was why you respected him. When we—" he cleared his throat. "When I betrayed my chivalric values, I betrayed myself, and in so doing I betrayed you. I ceased to be the man you desired, the man who deserved you, and doomed our love from its very inception. It is a sad paradox, I confess it," he continued after a pause. "If we admit to a love that is founded on shame and embrace our base desires, we betray ourselves and commit to living a life founded on desire and deceit. And if we do not, we maintain our honor and self-respect by betraying our love. And then we willfully choose to live in agony. What fool chooses the agony?" "I choose the agony of lying on this damned root," Aelfric thought bitterly, torn between an overwhelming desire to shift positions and a compulsion to eavesdrop on the rest of the conversation. His curiosity soundly defeated his discomfort, and he remained still. Gawain paused again, waited. Heather replied only with stony silence. The hiss of the dying fire and the droning crickets filled the void. An owl hooted somewhere beyond the henge. "A knight chooses the agony," he added at last. "A lady chooses the agony. We may have been weak for a moment, but we will not commit to a life of weakness and lies, no matter the physical or emotional reward. I will not, in any event." "You're morally right, of course," Heather responded finally. Her voice, too, was filled with emotion. "And the irony is that this decision will make you more desirable, and my acceptance of it will amplify your love for me." She sighed. "This is the kind of thing, I suppose, that troubadours sing tragic love songs about. I always thought they were just fiction." "They are," he sighed. "Love is always a fiction, written in the heart of a man or a woman. Only when two fictions align do we call it true." Most romances are short and trite, many are passionate, some are farcical, and a very few are tragic. Enough of this, Heather said, cutting him off, turning away and putting a note of finality in her voice. If this is to be the way of it, I am content. I will always have my memories. Many women don't even have that comfort. At the moment, however, we have a king to rescue, and on the morrow you may have 2 battles to fight. Get your sleep, sir. I'll take the first watch. She walked away, and the conversation ended. Alanbart's jealousy returned as he thought of it. Could she be Gawain's Helen? His Dido, Brunhilde, Isolde, Delilah? There were so many stories from which to choose, yet all ended much the same way. Tragic love couldn't be so uncommon an occurrence as it seemed. Had he stopped to consider it, he might have noted the irony that Gawain was the romantic one of the pair, and that Heather's calm acceptance of the facts showed that, though women are frequently labeled as the more emotional sex, they are perhaps better equipped to handle disappointments in matters of love, certainly less likely to take drastic action, and less apt to repeat the same mistake with a different partner. He remained seated on the rock as dawn turned the east from amethyst to rose. His gaze focused on a tall thistle plant. Its spiked leaves and stellated globe topped with purple petals, almost like hair, sparkled with drops of dew. A honeybee buzzed near and landed on one of the blossoms. The stem swayed. As the bee pollinated the thistle, Alanbart heard a few crackling steps in the scorched grass behind him. He began to rise as Heather sat beside him. He grunted a hello, conflicted. He tried to sound cranky, to send her away, but suddenly it seemed that his tongue swelled and he couldn't speak. He focused back on the flower. The bee flew away. He tried to stand. Please stay. She touched his forearm. You don't mind some company, do you? In the morning I usually do, he replied. But no, he cleared his throat, not this morning. The plan seems to be progressing, she said, making conversation, but I'm worried about this undead woman. I agree, Alanbart said. The whole idea of battling a banshee seems to benefit our druid friend. He gets a powerful staff and his sight back, and we get a hammer. Yes, Heather agreed. But we cannot forget that she is allied with Malastare and helped in the ambush on the moors, so strategically it makes sense to eliminate her before she can join her forces with those of the tower. Otherwise I might have objected. True, but I don't trust Cap bad, Alanbart said, lowering his voice and glancing back at the henge. His goals align with yours until Malastare is defeated and the power of the tower is smashed. At that point, he may as well become a foe. Heather nodded, but didn't add anything. The silence became strained. I'm glad that Gawain is taking my place in the attack, Alanbart admitted. The plan stands a better chance of success with his presence, since I'm not much of a fighter. Indeed, I'm pleased to think that at least I will not be dying this morning, which increases my chances of not being the corpse to fulfill Cathbad's prophecy by 50%. He forced a chuckle, then changed the subject. It's funny, is it not, that I was born possessed with the qualities of my mother, and you were born possessed with what I assume are the qualities of your father? By rights, you should be the knight, and I should be the lady. Heather smiled sympathetically in answer. My father was a man by the name of King Pellinore. He wasn't really a king, not in the true sense, but he did fight both for and against Arthur and his knights. I never knew him, but the stories I'm told portray him as a big, confident man with a quick mind and a lucky streak. I like to imagine that I take after him. He's dead now. Alanbart covered her hand awkwardly with his, and opened his mouth to say something that he hoped would sound comforting. Heather cut him off, but did not pull away. No, don't tell me that you're sorry for me. I cannot feel a sense of loss for someone that I never met. I'm not his legitimate daughter. I knew neither my father nor my mother. She died giving birth to me, and he, well, being good-hearted but ashamed of my birth, sent me to foster in a wealthy house. Another silence passed between them. Alanbart ventured to break it. You know Sir Gawain well? He asked lamely. Fool, imbecile, he thought. Just change the subject. Too well, I fear, she replied. A year ago I fell in love with him, and he with me. She slid her hand out from beneath his and used it to gesticulate, adding emphasis to her final words. I don't want to burden you with the details. Ah, he managed. It's over now, she added quickly. Why would you tell me that? Alanbart wondered. It couldn't have ended any other way, Heather continued with artificial cheerfulness. I'm illegitimate, and he's a knight, the nephew of the king and heir to the throne of Orkney. Save Mordred, Gawain is also first in line for Arthur's throne. Worse, there's bad blood between our families, and his people would never accept me. And, We have more in common than you think. Gawain also killed my father in single combat." Aelfric laughed out loud, but regretted it immediately. "He killed your father, and you claim to love him?" he asked, incredulous. "You forget that I never knew my father. I only saw him once, and that was from across a room when I was very young," she replied. "Sir Gawain had honorable motives. How does the proverb go? It's better to avenge a death than mourn one." "Then I must say that Sir Gawain is a very fortunate man on 4 counts," Aelfric concluded. "He has a lordship, powerful relatives, immense wealth, and your love." He paused. "As for the impossibility of that relationship, I wish I could find words to comfort you, but they would ring false because I'm actually quite pleased about it," he thought. "Because, truth be told, I've never been in love," he said instead. "Never?" she asked, dubious. "But you must be at least 30 years old." "Not quite," he answered, and added, "and no, never. Love is dangerous, and I've only lived this long through a highly balanced combination of superior intelligence and abject cowardice, neither of which support the concept of passionate love. You see, one has to be both brave and a bit of a fool to fall in love. I am certainly no fool, and I have never been brave, not in the traditional sense. Odd, though, that I should be willing to admit to you so openly something that I have kept carefully hidden from everyone else. Perhaps it shows some little courage and foolishness after all." He smiled, shrugged, and returned to gazing at the thistle. Heather sighed. "I'd say that love is wonderful, and that the lack of it has been a great hole in your life. But at the moment I'm not sure that that is true." She stood, then changed the subject. "Would you be willing to ride to Camelot? By your own admission, you're no good to us in a fight, and if we fail we will need to be rescued. Perhaps you can alert Arthur's knights and try and arrive before Mordred does." "I might be convinced to do so," Aelfric answered, "but I'll need rations, a map, a letter of introduction, and a plea for aid written by Sir Gawain, someone to whom they would listen. And I need to be paid. I'm already down a surcoat, plume, and shield." "I'll see about getting the letter," she responded. "My influence on payment is rather limited. However, I'm sure that the king would be open-handed to his rescuers. He has a history of giving lavish rewards to those who please him." "And what are the odds of success?" Aelfric mused. "Not good, I'd wager, pagan omens aside." At that moment Scot stepped out of the henge, yawned, and stretched his arms behind his back, whipping them forward with an audible pop. He patted his belly, smiled, and said, "I hope breakfast will be ready before long. I cannot perform acts of heroic courage on an empty stomach." He grinned at Heather and added, "Come on in and keep your companion company. He isn't one for trivial talk." "Where's Cathbad?" she asked. "He left before daybreak with Brusac to gather the goblins of the Gloamwood." "I saw Brusac go," Aelfric affirmed, "but Cathbad wasn't with him." "He was. He transformed into a crow and sat on Brusac's shoulder. He's an old man and moves much more swiftly that way. Say," he interrupted himself, "when are we going to get painted for the party?" "Whenever you like," Aelfric responded. "And then we'll get you deafened. There are a few choice words that I've always longed to say to a certain knight, and I'm looking forward to the deafenings almost as much as you're looking forward to the painting." He clapped Scot on the shoulder and turned him toward the henge. They ducked beneath the low-hanging limb and down the slate stairs. Inside, Gawain tested the blade of his oversized green axe on his thumbnail. Whetstone in hand, a blackened copper pot full of simmering water and oatmeal heated over a small cook fire. "Let's put this plan into action," Gawain said, nodding at Scot. He glanced at Heather, but ignored Aelfric. "From what I gathered last night, we have 8 leagues to ride, a battle to fight, and 8 leagues to ride back, all before mid-afternoon. I'm not one to put off work when there's a job to do." "Good," Scot nodded. "I'll be back with the paint. You may choose to be blue or yellow." Gawain grimaced and thought for a moment. "If it's all the same to you, I'll mix them and wear green. I have a certain affinity for that color, and your giant, Gonoth is it, has recalled to my mind my first real adventure. If this ends up being my last, at least going out in green would bring some continuity to the stories they sing of me." "Certainly," Scot said, stepping out the far entrance and leaving Gawain, Aelfric, and Heather alone. Gawain returned to sharpening his axe. "Shink! Shink!" went the whetstone, breaking the silence. "Does Scot have a horse?" Heather asked. "Not that I've seen," Gawain replied. "They keep no animals here, aside from that old warhound that follows you everywhere." Can he ride Taffy? Heather asked. I thought you wanted me to ride south, Alanbart replied somewhat defensively. It seems to me that time is of the essence here. You could ride south this afternoon as easily as now, and if Scot cannot ride, it will more than double their travel time. Alanbart looked at Gawain. Can't you both ride Gringolet? He's horse enough for 2 riders, especially if they're without armor. Gringolet is beginning to show his years, and will suffer no rider but me, Gawain answered. Shink, went his whetstone. Heather sent a pleading look at Alanbart. He hesitated. Taffy was his only friend. Silly, he thought, to be so attached to a horse, but still. If you're willing to pay me for his service, certainly an arrangement can be made, Alanbart said at last. I've already lost a shield and accrued a lot of unnecessary expenses. No one's lining up to reimburse me. Please forgive the question, but are you a merchant or a knight? Gawain scoffed. By God, I'd never sully my name by bartering service like some Jew tradesman. That's because your income has always far exceeded your expenditures, Alanbart responded. You're the nephew of a king and the son of a great lord, not some pauper knight living off his wits alone. It must be easy to look down on others when you're standing atop a pile of gold. Shink, went the whetstone. Alanbart hesitated, looked at the axe, swallowed, and took a step backward, but continued. Maybe you think I'm crass to speak of it, but I grew up without a father and without a lord. We had no lands, no income, and nothing but our family name and coat of arms to rely upon. If you think back on it, you may even realize that we had your sword arm to thank for our condition. However, so that you will stop slandering my surname, I'll solve your little problem by taking my horse off the market. He turned his back on Gawain and walked toward the stairs, suddenly determined to mount Taffy and ride north. Heather stood between them, indecisive. She shot Gawain a dark look, but made no motion to follow Alanbart. What a contrast the 2 men made, she thought. Gawain sat unconcerned, a powerful hero, handsome, honorable, confident, yet unyielding and somewhat self-righteous, which, though well-meaning, could come across as intolerant, even arrogant. And then there walked Alanbart, far less imposing physically, but undeniably intelligent. He was a self-proclaimed coward, yet she suspected that his cowardice was merely a shield. Against what? She thought. At the very least, he intrigued her, and could hold up his end of a conversation, and he looked cute in his own awkward way. Nothing compared to Gawain, of course, just somehow new and refreshing after the stifling atmosphere of Camelot, which overflowed with bombast, posturing, and hypocrisy. Sir Alanbart, Gawain called after a moment, some hesitation in his voice, regardless of my personal distaste for your lack of moral... your personal code of behavior, I find that I do require your horse. Also, you may discover that I am not without sympathy for your widowed mother and fatherless childhood. Indeed, I feel that it is much to blame for your current mistaken attitudes. No true knight should be raised entirely by women. He looked at Heather and added courteously, just as, I'm sure you'd agree, my lady, that no true lady should be brought up by men. Heather shrugged. After a pause, Gawain finished. If you would allow me to do so, I am willing to personally pay you some restitution for your loss. I keep a small amount of money in my saddlebags, and would use it to buy your good opinion, so that you would be more inclined to lend us your horse. Alanbart faltered. He swiveled to face Gawain. However, before he could speak, Scot re-entered the henge with one large wooden bowl and one small hollowed gourd, both full of pigment. The bowl contained a bright cobalt paste, while the gourd sloshed with a more soupy paint of a mustard yellow. Also, at that moment, the oatmeal started to boil over, steaming and plopping glops into the flames. It hissed, and an acrid smoke rose from the cook fire. Alanbart fixed his blue eyes on the oatmeal and sighed. Very well. I'll take charge of breakfast then, shall I? He stepped toward the fire, then added to Heather, I imagine that I've cooked more oatmeal breakfasts than you have, my lady. She nodded. Scot began reapplying his war paint, slathering his chest with thick clumps of blue pigment, and spreading it in expanding circles with his fingers. I'll need help with my back, he said, looking at Heather. Would you honor me? I'll do it. Gawain cut in abruptly, leaping to his feet. He cleared his throat and gave his axe one last self-conscious stroke with the whetstone. Shink! Then set it down. Alanbart crouched, and using the hem of his tunic as a buffer, pulled the kettle from the fire by its copper handle. Heather sat gracefully on the stones near Alanbart. She glanced across the circle at the wolfhound, who lay sprawled on his side near the stairs. his moist eyes resting on her. She smiled softly and patted the earth beside her. The dog stood, stretched arthritically, and lumbered over to where she sat, tongue lolling from his mouth. She gently scratched his curly gray scruff as he curled up on her feet. Gawain broke the silence, eyeing the blue paint with obvious distaste. "Scot, you're certainly skilled with a sword, and so you have gained some of my respect. Yet I must ask, why have you dedicated yourself to serving the pagan gods of a druid?" "Because I disagree with your way of life," Scot responded. "Is it chivalry with which you disagree?" Gawain asked. "No, not at all. Quite the contrary. I honor those few heroes who uphold the code, and, as a guide for a generally honorable lifestyle, I applaud it. Primarily, I protest against the lie perpetrated upon the peasantry by those two-faced tyrants who name themselves noble. They claim to want to bring peace and prosperity to the land and to protect the people, but in reality they starve the serfs and force them to fight, where they're slaughtered by the hundreds and thousands. It is the hypocrisy inherent in your system that enrages me." "King Arthur isn't like that," Gawain answered. Scot rounded on him. "Have you waged no wars? Does Arthur not wish to conquer all of Britannia? Whom does Malastair of the Tower serve?" "I think it's safe to say that Malastair serves either my bastard brother or himself. As for the wars, certainly there have been many, and it is the avowed wish of Arthur to hold all of Britannia, yet he wishes only to bring peace to this island, as there once was for hundreds of years under Roman rule. When there is one lord with unquestioned power, there is no dissent, no strife. We would be a nation worthy of the name, not some ragtag quilt of feuding clans." "Peace!" Scot scoffed. "For how long? Until Guinevere bears Lancelot's child? Until Arthur dies? Until Sir Mordred lays claim to the kingdom?" Gawain chewed his lower lip a long while in response. Finally he offered a reply. "I admit that things haven't gone as planned, and are unlikely to return to plan, but since when does failure diminish the grand vision? Besides, I have sworn my fealty to King Arthur, to live and die by his side, fighting his quarrels, be they just or unjust. By God, I am a man of honor, and I will keep my vow. And I, for my part, will continue to combat to convert this island back to, as you so beautifully put it, a ragtag quilt of feuding clans. And this is my reason. Unlike a kingdom, a clan is never so large that its leaders cease to care about its individual members. They are family, and all of them are important. Certainly feuds go on, sometimes for generations, but they are small in scope, as is the carnage they cause. And when Childebert, king of the Franks, sails north with his grand army, or when Halfdan the Black and the berserking Northmen sail west, what then? Your day is over, my friend, precisely for the reason that you first mentioned. A clan is never big enough, you said. True, and I will complete the idea. A clan is never big enough to defend itself against a kingdom. That is why the Romans won. It is why we won. It is why you will always lose. Footnote. If you'll excuse me for butting into my own story again, I might clarify that Gawain's assertion that chivalrous knights defeated the Britons because of their disunity is, as is everything said by idealists, a bit misleading. In the actual event, William the Bastard, a fitting moniker for the man, and his, quote, chivalric followers defeated a well-organized and unified Anglo-Saxon army at Hastings, half a millennium after the Britons were expelled from England. As far as William's invasion goes, luck played as much a role in that as anything else. If some unknown Norman archer had not shot King Harold Godwinson through the eye slit of his helm, threading the needle, so to speak, history may have turned out quite differently. Speaking of kings and arrows, though, you might be surprised how often an absurdly lucky shot altered medieval English history. For example, less than 3 weeks before Hastings, a Viking king by the name of Harold Haradra, one of the most interesting figures in medieval history, I only wish that I had time to tell his tale, went down to death at Stamford with an arrow through his throat. And for an additional example, let us take the Battle of Shrewsbury. In that one conflict alone, rebel leader Henry Hotspur lifted his visor to issue an order, only to have a fatal encounter with an arrow that flew into his open mouth. Simultaneously, on the other side of the lines, Prince Henry of Monmouth took an arrow to the face, yet he lived through a miracle of medieval surgery and then became the victor at Agincourt, a whole battle won by bowshot. So, To bring us back to my original point, it seems to me that Gawain's response proves that we always find logical reasons to support the natural occurrence of random events. We call the chronicle of these reasons history. Once established, we retell it again and again until it rings true and becomes, through repetition, accepted fact. Gawain certainly accepted his version of the facts, and as Scot did not argue the point, it seems that he did too. With no response forthcoming, Gawain scooped up some blue paint, fidgeted for a moment in discomfort, and then asked, "Are you ready?" "Yes," Scot replied. He again turned his back to Gawain. The knight's muscles were taut, and his jaw worked beneath his skin. Ignoring his own discomfort, Gawain began to spread the blue dye over Scot's shoulders and back, keeping himself at arm's length, and as far from Scot as possible during such an intimate moment. Heather hid a smile, an amused smile, behind her hand. After a few tense seconds, Scot said grimly, "You know, of course, that you'll have to back your beliefs with your blade once all this is over." "I will," Gawain agreed, "but regardless of which of us is the victor in that combat, time will prove me right. A duel does not change the world, it only affects the lives of two men and their families." "Breakfast is ready," Aelfric interrupted, eating a clumpy and steaming bite of oatmeal off the end of a wooden spoon. He set the pot down beside Heather. She nodded, accepted the spoon, and ate, her face carefully impassive. Aelfric absently ran a hand along the dog's back. "It'd be better with milk or nuts or fruit," he said apologetically. "Thank you," she replied, and her eyes returned to the two warriors. She waited for them to resume their debate, but they seemed to have reached an impasse. In the interim, Gawain rushed to finish smearing paint on Scot. In his hurry, he slapped a large blue glop on the small of the swordsman's back. It began to run down his spine beneath the line of his belt. Gawain said. "What are you doing?" Scot snapped over his shoulder. "Don't stand there like a lump. Stop it before it runs down the crack in my ass." "Sorry, my dear," he amended, glancing apologetically at Heather. Gawain reached out a hand, slid it beneath Scot's belt line, then drew it out quickly, gasping. "By all that's holy, I'll not touch you there when you can reach yourself." "All right, then," Scot sighed, and dug his hand down his pants, dredging up a glob of blue paint. He flicked it into the bowl. "A second longer, and I would have been blue down to my nether eye." He blushed. Sorry again," he nodded to Heather. "I forget my manners among so many men." He handed the bowl back to Gawain, who eyed it doubtfully and cleared his throat again. The knight held the bowl a long while before he could bring himself to dip his fingers in, continuing more slowly and carefully than before. Aelfric said, "Scot, it seems to me that you see some of the problems of knighthood quite clearly, but you miss the fundamental one. The priests tell us that according to the law of Moses, we should not kill other Christians. And yet, we constantly fight amongst ourselves. In fact, the very act of swearing fealty to a lord demands that a knight fight all the lord's enemies in all quarrels. The duty to one's lord is thus placed above the duty to the Lord. And yet the system would also have us believe that our lords are placed above us by God's will. Each has a divine right to rule. It's a paradox that I have never been able to reconcile. Interestingly," he continued, "your old way neatly solves that little problem. As I understand it, the warrior code of Woden suggests that killing a fellow believer in battle actually sends him directly to Valhalla. So, in effect, you're doing him a favor, and your conscience is clear." He scoffed to add emphasis to his last point. "For a Christian, if you kill a knight in battle and he has already killed another Christian combatant, then you send that knight to judgment with a mortal sin on his soul and doom him to eternal torment in hell." Everyone paused to consider his statement. In the end, Gawain smirked. "Actually, I prefer to send my king's enemies to hell. I'm done here." He slapped Scot on the shoulder with a powerful blue hand, leaving a splattered print. Scot dribbled yellow pigment in with the blue and mixed them to a grass-green color. "It's your turn." He handed the bowl back to Gawain. The knight nodded curtly, and after another obvious internal struggle, began to slather his shoulders and chest. "And if I might change the subject," Scot added, "I've been meaning to ask you, Sir Gawain, why did you first decide to fight for King Arthur?" The tension faded as Gawain broke into a sad smile full of memory. "There were many reasons. Arthur is my uncle, of course, so kinship drew me to him. But more than that, he was doing something new. Chivalry was never heard of before, at least not in Britannia, and I fell in love with the ideal. You might say it has been the one true love of my life. He stumbled there, cleared his throat, but continued. Before King Arthur, warriors were brutes. Oh, certainly, many were honorable brutes, I don't deny that. But they had no code to guide their actions. They served no greater good than their own desires. At best, the desire to become famous after death, and at worst, the twin desires for power and riches. King Arthur serves the chivalric code, faith in God, courtesy toward those who depend on his strength, honor towards his fellow men, courage in battle, and humility. 5 pillars, 5 points to the star, a shining star to guide men across the sea of life. He trailed off, and his eyes focused on his shield, which lay against the stone wall under the shade of the trees. Imagine a world like that, he said to Scot. A world where everyone believes in and lives up to the code of chivalry. I would die for that vision. Now, let's face the facts, Aelfric interrupted, some wry amusement in his tone. Ideals and visions aside, you both fight for the same reason, because you're damn good at it. When you're good at something, doing it is fun. Also, you both value honor because it lends your fighting a moral imperative. You both want to be right, or on the good side in battle, to keep your consciences clean. But you come at it from completely opposite perspectives. Sir Gawain, you find your moral imperative in what could be. You're a romantic who fights for an unattainable and ideal future that is pure and good. He shifted his gaze to Scot. And you find your imperative in what once was, an Edenic vision of the past that never existed. Neither of you like the world as it is, and both of you see the other as the problem. Aelfric paused, watching the leaves rustle overhead, then concluded, You know, that's the trouble with this world. Half of the dreamers want to carry us forward kicking and screaming into an unrealistic and unattainable future, and the other half want us to fall back into an imaginary, simpler time where everything was easy. He sat back, content that he'd summed up the problems of the world in a phrase. Perhaps he had. Gawain and Scot both looked at him accusatorily, with sullen expressions. Heather seemed amused, but when Gawain shot her a dark look, she pretended to be famished and ate oatmeal, avoiding all of them. It's not every day that you see someone outdo Sir Gawain at anything, she thought, and Aelfric just cut him down with words effortlessly. It seems that there's more to this pauper knight than he lets on. Of course, Aelfric continued, enjoying himself immensely and conscious for the first time that he was putting on a show for Heather's benefit. It was the closest he dared come to combat. You both hate me because I speak the truth. I'm a cynic. I see things as they are, adapt myself to them, and make the best of a situation. I know that I lack the power to change the world, and so I don't even try. If I do ever offer to sacrifice myself for king or an ideal, just fling me from the top of the nearest tower and be done with me. Gawain glowered at him, and Scot shrugged and began spreading green paint on Gawain's shoulders and neck. He did it much more comfortably than Gawain had, rubbing the paint in concentric circles, seeming to view the knight's back as a canvas and himself as a great artist. He spoke as he worked, not looking up. Sir Gawain, you truly have the shoulders and back of a great hero. Surely Thor himself had similar musculature, or Beowulf or Sigmund, broad as a bear's back, firm as oak. As a fellow man and aspiring hero myself, I have to admit to some little jealousy. He tenderly squeezed the muscle right over Gawain's shoulder blade, causing the knight to almost leap out of arm's reach. Eyes wide, he stared back at Scot and cleared his throat again, louder still than before. I thank you for the compliment, man, but by God, just finish the job, please, without further comment or caress. As you will, Scot continued as if nothing had happened. In answer to you, Sir Alanbart, he said, I don't dare dream that I'll actually alter the world, but as opposed to you, I'm willing to try. Death comes to us all in this mortal life, even to the great and the glorious, and for my part, I'd be blessed to be remembered as a hero in a ballad. He stepped back to see if he'd missed any spots, and seeing one, returned to fill it, continuing as if he had not paused at all. Personally, I'd choose to die attempting some great feat, even die in failure, rather than live in ease and accomplish nothing. Songs reach out of the past and inhabit the hearts and minds of those living in the present, so I wouldn't truly be dead. And I, Gawain said, stepping quickly away from Scot and his paint, would live a life dedicated to my ideal. Perhaps, as you say, Sir Alanbart, I cannot change the world, yet I can change myself, and be an example to others who would follow my way of life. Avalanches start with small stones, and blizzards begin with the smallest of flakes. I am and will remain of small stature in the history of this land, but perhaps, through the grace of God, I can accomplish big things. Aelfric shook his head. Optimists, he said, but his tone showed that he was a bit moved. He picked up the pot of oatmeal and carried it to them. Here, eat. Then you can get your hair done and Gawain's face made up so that you can go and die like the heroes you are. Maybe I'll write your song one day, and then we can all get what we want. You can each sacrifice your physical mortality to become literarily immortal, and through your deaths, I'll gain a stable income. And that's the end of Chapter 10. Again, the story is called 3 Days and 2 Nights, an amusing Arthurian adventure. My name is Scot Howard. I'm the author. The book is being published by the Piedmont Journal of Poetry and Fiction. It's a small market Virginia press that you can find online at www.piedmontjpf.com. If you would like updates, you can like me on Facebook. My author page is Scott Davis Howard on Facebook and also on Twitter. So feel free to like me, and I'll keep you updated on all the latest releases and when the actual print book is coming out in July and all that kind of stuff. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. We'll be producing another one next week, and we will continue until we're caught up on what's been published online, and from there we'll continue to publish new sections and with them new podcasts as time permits. Again, as always, I encourage you to share. We're a small market press and don't have the funds that something like Galance or Penguin has. So we really depend on word of mouth, people who enjoy our products and pass them on to their friends and neighbors and encourage the listening. Right now, everything's free. I encourage you to spread the word while it is and get as many people reading as we possibly can. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to having you back with me next time. Have a good rest of your day. Thank you.